Hi, American Lit students. Congratulations on submitting your first project or essay number one. I very much enjoyed reading what you wrote about and getting to see the different versions of those multimodal projects, as well as the tried and true trusty literary analysis essay. I hope you had a pleasant fourth, and we are just about in the midterm section of our time together, which means I will be calculating your midterm grades and putting those in Blackboard too. And this week, week 7, we are moving into writings that deal with the Harlem Renaissance. So you will be reading the works of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and W.E.B. Du Bois. So we've touched a little bit on the notion of the Harlem Renaissance, a time in the early 20th century, 1920s, when you had this surge of African-American art and gathering in Harlem, New York, and you had a proliferation of writers, musicians, and artists, and a dedication and recognition of the artworks that were being created by Black Americans. You will find when you read the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, this notion of double consciousness, the idea that when you are Black in America, given our history of enslaving Black Americans, that you have this inability to really fit in the colonized white society. You're never completely accepted. And so you have to put on this facade, as we read in the Mask poem from a couple weeks ago, and how this creates an internal conflict for people, particularly for people of color. It's commonly modernly known as code switching, this idea that you have to be able to switch who you are dependent on the situation you're in, the people you're around. And to a degree, all of us do this. We put on a different persona when we're at work versus when we're with family versus when we're with friends. It changes the words we use, it changes the mannerisms we use, it changes the formality levels. But for people who have a history of being enslaved and colonized, it is a greater burden to bear because they don't feel like they ever can achieve this sense of equality, and they always have to be putting on a facade around, particularly around white America. So you're going to be reading those works. You might recognize the works of Langston Hughes from the play A Raisin in the Sun, which is based on a line from a Langston Hughes poem about a dream deferred. And so it's a rich week. I've posted quite a few supplemental materials that you can take a look at to learn more about the Harlem Renaissance if you don't know a lot about it yet. And then I've also posted some materials on critical theory. You're not necessarily diving deeply into critical theory this term, but I wanted to introduce you to it. And if you intend to go further into English literature, American or British or other literatures in your studies, it's a good thing to start becoming familiar with. And when we think about critical theory, we're thinking about different lenses in which to understand literature. And so some of the more common ones, I think I've only listed 8 here, there are more than that. But you have the lens of psychoanalysis when you are trying to psychoanalyze characters, their motivations, their impulses, their desires. Maybe they know it or they don't know it. So if you're interested in psychology, that can be an interesting approach to understanding literature. The one that I am most versed in, the one that I wrote my master's thesis on, is feminism. So being able to look at the creation of characters, plot lines, the depiction of femininity of women in literature, and how that is created in a patriarchal world, especially when we're reading American literature. You have the modern and postmodern critical theories, you have gender studies critical theories, you have reader response critical theories. So I've posted some videos that I made a while ago that runs through a summary of each of those. Again, it can depend on your own inclinations, proclivities, interests into which type of theory you might be most interested in, but take a look at those just to familiarize yourself with the options. What we tend to do in classes like this is we do more of a reader response theory, whereas we are reacting individually to the text, trying to somewhat separate out the author of the time period. Although obviously it's hard to not take those things into account. The nice thing about that type of theory is that it's approachable. You don't need to know a lot about time periods. You don't need to know a lot about the author. You're simply responding to the text. But we also know that's nearly impossible to do in the world, to not take into account, well, this piece was written in the 1950s versus this piece was written in the 1880s, and here's what's happening in the world, here's what's happening to the author at the time. All those things factor into it. So when you're reading pieces by Du Bois and by Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, obviously their lived experiences as people of color in America during this time of the Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, that affects what they create. It has a certain representation of the time in which they were living. And to discount that, I think, does a disservice to our own analysis of these pieces. So that is there for supplemental information. And I hope you enjoy this week's readings and begin thinking maybe about what you want to do for your upcoming essay too. And as I said, I will post those midweek or midterm grades soon. Take care.